Hi, this is Mr. Smith in day 4 of unit number 7 in AP European History. So what did you learn about France, Britain, and Spain in this unit? That comes from the previous day of notes, so you can enter that into the Canvas chat. The assignment for today is the document-based question, and these actually are both documents within the textbook, so make sure you look at page 476 and 487 for these documents. For each document, answer the question once you click submit and type in the text box, what is the main idea, and what are the 3 pieces of evidence that prove the main idea. And then make sure you answer the questions. What is the historical context? How are the documents similar? And how are they different? Then continue on with the notes. So today we'll look at the economic advance and social unrest. Industrial society in Europe, population grows. People move throughout Europe, even within countries, from one place to another. Cities start to balloon in size, which comes along with some growing pains, including the fact that they don't know what to do with wastewater and trash. And lots of people in close proximity means there's going to be an increase in crime and disease. Rural areas would see the abolishment of serfdom in the countries of Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Although in those places, relatively speaking, rural people will stay rural, and not a lot will change. Even though they're not serfs, they're still beholden to the aristocracy. Railroads started to grow, especially in the countries of England, Belgium, northern France, and Germany. They created an ease of movement for both goods and services and people, and led to the birth of more industrialization since they required things like iron ore, steel, coal, and so on. And there you can see the network of railroads, particularly aggressive in Germany, but also in England. Notice they're not in Ireland or Scotland. They're not in southern France. They're mostly not in southern Europe, except for a few places in between some major towns, a little bit in Austria, and then, of course, not in most of Eastern or extreme northern Europe. Labor. There was a split in the labor force. Some people held jobs that were long-term, that had a high pay, and some held jobs that were more temporary, that had lower pay. So proletariat is the name of the workforce, and proletarianization is the workers' labor that became a commodity, something that can be bought and sold. So instead of people staying on their own land, farming their own crops, making their own goods, now they're selling their labor to someone else. So the factory owner supplies the materials while the workers contribute their labor for wages. But that also meant that they were subject to the employer's rules and punishments, and the employer had a lot of control since most employees could be easily replaced. The old guild system didn't really apply to a lot of these new jobs. The guild system was an earlier form of labor union where people within certain crafts could agree on setting a certain price for their wages, and they had a lot more control. But those became less and less popular with these new manufacturing and industrial-based factory jobs. Confection, goods such as shoes that are produced in standard sizes rather than specifically for one customer, became more popular because of the mass production, the specialization. They could make the products cheaper, which of course meant more people could afford them, which meant that there was a higher standard of living. People suffered through maybe having a shoe that was a little bit too small or too big because it meant that they could actually go out and buy a new pair every year, for instance. Because of some of the concerns over these labor issues, Chartism would start to form in Britain. It was called that because people believed they could put forward a charter and a petition, specifically on 6 points to help reform elections and the plight of the working people in England. This would be submitted to Parliament, although it would not work for 2 reasons. One is that the Chartist movement was divided between those that wanted to use force and those that wanted to use peaceful methods. And the other reason is because the economy started to improve even more significantly, so people weren't as miserable and not as many people were pushing for reform by 1848. In the early factory system, the roles of the family stayed the same. The father was employed and also utilized labor of wives and children. But this new industrial factory-based system, instead of the old factory system that was home-based, they would use machines. Now, in some cases, this meant that unmarried women and children would be utilized in factories. The owners believed they could pay them less since they needed less to eat, They could utilize these individuals perhaps to work in tighter workspaces that men couldn't. And so wages for skilled laborers became high enough that some children were then able to leave the factory and go to school. So even though some children would be employed, in some places where there are higher wages, of course, the fathers could afford to take care of the family and didn't need their children to work, and so those children could go to school. So it was dependent upon the type of factory and what type of labor and what the pay was. The English Factory Act was passed in 1833, which of course cut back the hours and also the ages of people that could work. It was limited to 9 hours, for instance, per day for children at 9 to 13. And it did say that if children weren't going to school, then factories needed to provide at least some type of minimal education for the children. Parliament then passed a 10-hour workday in 1847 overall. And because people were able to find wages within the same city as their parents' children, and families often remained together for an extended period of time. Women, in the meantime, became associated with housekeeping, especially in Great Britain, food preparation, child rearing. So often these are the types of jobs that they would be hired for, especially in Britain, as I just mentioned. The earlier cottage industries, where women could make their own products, kind of fell by the wayside in some places, but in others, of course, they still remain popular, especially among single women and those that were widowed. Women that worked in factories were mostly unmarried or widows, though, because when someone did get married, they were discouraged from working either by their husbands or by the employer. Women in France still mostly worked in agricultural industries on the land, while in England, once again, they were working mostly as domestic servants. Women would leave the workforce if their husband's earnings were good enough, so marriage was less of an economic partnership. Women only worked outside the home when forced to because of circumstances, and in the meantime, women took care of the home and children. But as populations in cities continued to grow, so did crime rates, especially theft and arson. So eventually, countries came up with new systems of police force, especially in larger cities like London and Paris, beginning in 1828, in France in 1829, in England, where police were called bobbies because of part of their uniform. But prison reform is also taking place when we started to believe in separating different types of prisoners: the mentally insane, people that committed minor crimes, people that owed money, and then people that committed felonies or more serious crimes. In fact, in some cases, people that committed serious crimes were shipped out of the country where they committed the felony in the first place. But we started to look more at making prison more about rehabilitation instead of punishment. Prisoners were eventually isolated from each other, but too much isolation eventually caused problems with mental health. But prisoners would be taught some new skills or trade in an attempt to reform them and return them back to society. Seeing all these changes in society meant that some started to study these problems and possible solutions. Jeremy Bentham advocated for utilitarianism, which meant that he believed we should focus on the greatest happiness of the most amount of people. But that also means you have to sacrifice the wants and needs of the minority. A poor law was passed, which set out to make poverty the less desirable of all social situations and move more people into the bigger, happier group by establishing things like workhouses for the impoverished. Also, corn laws were repealed because that helped lower prices for food, which helped increase standard of living, so the greater good, instead of just benefiting large-scale rural landowners. They often advocated for the creation of individual communities, like Saint Simon. He didn't want to redistribute wealth, but wanted it to be managed by experts that could run these communities and coordinate activities in an efficient manner. Robert Owen saw no incompatibility between a humane industrial environment and good profit. So he did think it was okay to have factories as long as the people lived together and shared their resources. But unfortunately, not all these utopian communities ended up surviving for long. New Harmony, Indiana, though, saw a failure of its little civilization because of feuds amongst the workers. And Charles Fourier advocated the construction of phalanxes, agricultural communities where people did everyday tasks or different everyday tasks instead of doing the task over and over again, because he believed completing the same task over and over in this new industrial society ended up demeaning people and causing harm. And then there were the anarchists. These are people that either just wanted to get rid of the capitalist system or capitalism and the government, because they believe individuals could behave themselves on their own without any type of overarching structure. And then, of course, there was Karl Marx, who believed that class conflict between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the owning middle class, he believed that the problems created between the two because of industrialization would eventually lead to class warfare, and the proletariat or working class would rise up either through elections or through violence to take over the means of production and set up a socialist society. A co-author of his of the Communist Manifesto was Friedrich Engels, who presented a devastating picture of how terrible life would become in this new industrial society, and that people, of course, would realize this and revolt, taking over all of the means of production. Let's go ahead and stop there today. Don't forget about the DBQ for day number 4.